Welcome to Venture, the world of small business and big ideas. We welcome Andy Rosenwach to the program. Rosenwach is the manager of Rosenwach Tank, based here in New York City. Now, in the late 1800s, his great-grandfather, an immigrant from Poland, bought the company for $55. And now, Rosenwach is the leading tank manufacturing and servicing company in Manhattan.
Paris has the Eiffel Tower, Pisa has the Leaning Tower, and New York has the Water Tower. So says Rosenwach Tank president Andy Rosenwach. And he isn't kidding. Rooftop water tanks have been an integral part of the New York skyline for more than a century. The name behind the iconic tanks is Rosenwach. See the signature R branding on some of the city's best-known buildings? In case you were wondering, the tanks store water for drinking, bathing, and toilet flushing. They also help with fire protection for the buildings below. It's a family business that spans 4 generations. Andy's son, Henry Rosenwach, is now starting to take the reins. They're not alone in the market, though. Their one major rival, Isaac's Brothers, is also steeped in tradition. They've been around since the 1800s as well. But unlike the Isaac's Brothers, the Rosenwach mills are right in Brooklyn. Plus, Rosenwach can break down an old water tank and assemble a new one again in only 10 hours. They move quick, just like the rest of New York City. But with new technology and a constantly changing skyline, will the water tanks become a relic of the past?
And Andy Rosenwach with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. This is, I got to say, pretty excited about doing this segment because it's such an iconic image in New York City, are those water tanks. So I want to start off, I got a history lesson when I started researching for this interview, and I was reading about kind of where these water tanks came from. And the New York Historical Society was saying that the indoor plumbing in New York began kind of in the 1840s, and then all the tall buildings started popping up after the Civil War, and that's when these tanks started coming in. Now, your company, the Rosenwach Tank, was actually founded 30 years before your family owned it. Is that right?
That's correct.
So talk to me a little bit about that. How did your family end up with the company?
Well, the story originates where my great-grandfather, Harris, came from Poland and started working for a tank maker in the metropolitan area. In those days, I think it was basically a commercial business where you serviced tanneries or wineries, businesses that used vessels that they needed to contain water. And the story goes that Harris bought the business that he was employed under for $55. And
well, that money was supposed to be for something else. Is that right?
Well, I just can't remember.
Oh, I read that money was supposed to be able to bring his wife over.
Yes, and he did that eventually. He did that right after he bought the business, and he brought his family over, and here we are today. The actual name Rosenwach, story goes, was captured as he was leaving port in Europe. He picked up the name from a truck that was passing by, and we were derived from our own last name in Ellis Island from that quick observation as the boat was leaving Europe.
And the company has really grown over the years. Now, what percent of the tanks, when we look at the New York skyline, what percent of those tanks are from the Rosenwach Tank Company?
Well, you know, Chris, we're very happy just to keep busy, and we never count in terms of how many tanks are ours or how many tanks are someone else's.
But if you had to guess.
Well, if we go on top of the Empire State Building and look around, I think you'll see predominantly most of the tanks have been made by our company, just from different insignia of how we make the tank. We could recognize it.
Excellent. So I heard a lot of the tanks in the city were built kind of in the roaring 20s. After World War II, you guys were focused on real estate tanks. What do you think when your father and your grandfather was looking at the business as a whole? What was the hardest period throughout these years that the company's been?
We've gone through. I remember I entered into the business in '75. If you remember, in those years, '74, there was the hardship of standing in line for hours and hours just for a gallon of gas, and each year had its ups and downs with us. Whether there's a very high sense of busyness or a very slow time in the employment of our product, and we follow the economic situation in the city. For the last 10 years, we've been riding pretty well. The infrastructure in the city still defines the need for the water tank, especially since the sprinkler codes have been changed in the late 90s. We have buildings going up that require 30 to 50,000 gallon reserves, and the vessels are tremendous.
We'll have to talk a little bit about that. Andy Rosenwach, we're talking the tanks in New York City. We'll be back. You're watching Venture. Welcome back to Venture. I'm Chris Valerio. We're talking the water tanks that dot the New York skyline today with Mr. Andy Rosenwach. He is the partner, the president, I guess, of Rosenwach Tanks right now, of New York business. So let's talk a little bit about just how big the company is. So what is your annual revenue at this point?
We average about $20 million a year.
And how many employees do y'all have?
We have a steady employment of about 100 people. And it's a large family. We work together continually, whether it's good times or bad times. There's always something to do.
Did you ever think, I don't want to join the family business? We've been around for so long. Maybe I'll pass.
Well, I always had the intention of working with my father. And as he once told me, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And my grandfather, I remember him, and we were all very close together. And I had a wonderful 25 years embracing him and learning from him. If it wasn't his insistence, I never would have went to a financial degree in NYU as a master's. But my biggest educational feat was getting my master's in plumbing from the Department of Buildings. And that was wonderful. And I went on to become a refrigeration operator.
Now, that actually played into the business model, though, correct?
Exactly. Same thing with a refrigeration operator, because on top of the buildings in New York, we not only have water tanks, but we have cooling towers. And every cooling tower in the 60s had what's known as a wooden wet deck. And guess what? The wooden wet deck was made out of redwood, and we were at that time the biggest source of redwood east of the Mississippi.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because you guys have a mill. You actually mill the wood that you use, which is cedar. Is that correct, that you're using cedar for these wood tanks?
Yes, it's a western cedar. Okay,
so you actually mill in Brooklyn, in New York City, at a time when a lot of manufacturing is leaving the city. So how have you maintained that decision to stay in the city?
With a love and passion for the people we work with, and the families we've learned to know, and the customer base we have. The land never disappears. It may only get more valuable if you live long enough. And we always believe with whatever we have and what little we have, we try to share, and we also try to pass down.
Now, certainly, I mean, City Hall has a whole department dedicated to trying to keep manufacturing in New York City. Is there incentives that they offer you? Are there are there any kind of certain incentives or rebates that you're given for manufacturing in the city?
Well, we do have a incentive tax-wise in terms of our own facility for the real estate tax. But Chris, I would love to talk to someone in the department in the city to recognize the expense we go through in terms of servicing a product that without the water tank, New York would go dry. And it's very difficult given the responsibility of insurance and compensation and catering to the environmental laws that we are now working with, as well as safety. And we comply with everything. And we're very proud to work alongside the people that monitor us.
You mentioned several things there. Which is the biggest challenge right now, operating as a company that's more than 100 years old, much more than 100 years old? What's the biggest challenge right now, operating in a modern environment and working with still some pretty old-fashioned technology when we think about the wooden tanks? The biggest challenge is the workers' safety and being able to comply with a environment that asks us to be very careful before we take the next step. And when we're on top, there's nothing to hang on to. So we're working out there without nets. It's like watching someone and a great bit of talent and skill as you would watch a circus performer. Well, from a financial standpoint, what does that translate for you guys? It translates into an expense on insurance and additional safety courses and how come there aren't more companies coming into this area of competition? I mean, you have your competitors that have also been around for quite a long time, but other than that, what do you expect to see competition come into this? Well, my father, who was the Pied Piper of New York, would always tell people that we're in a dying business. and he was so credible that I think his word was quite believable. But the business, in any business, it's what you do now. It's how you achieve tomorrow. You heard it from Andy Rosenwach, the president of Rosenwach Tanks. We're talking the tanks that dot the skyline of New York. You're watching Venture. Welcome back to Venture. I'm Chris Valerio. We are talking the tanks that dot the skyline of New York. Take a look. We are a business of manufacturing and installing and servicing the wood and steel tanks in Manhattan. The company was founded by my great-grandfather in the 1890s, and it's been carried on from father to son. The water tanks are essential to the city to provide the buildings with drinking water, the water that people shower with, washing water, and more particularly, the tanks service the needs to fight fire. Over the years, I've heard stories where people have told me that when they look up and see a wooden barrel on top of a building in New York City, they consider it vacant or they consider it empty, out of use. They have no idea what it's there for. I remember going over the Williamsburg Bridge with my father when I was about 12 years old, and he said, look, as long as you want to be in this business, there'll be enough business, at least for taking apart the tanks. He, in other words, never envisioned that the utility of a wooden water tank would be around at this day and age. But it is. We have new construction going in every month, and we're putting up 20 or 30,000 gallon tanks on top of those buildings. I estimate there are about 15,000 tanks in New York City. New York is one big tank town. And Andy Rosenwach with us today, and we just wanted to show that because it's such an interesting process. I actually got to go up on a roof and watch it happen, and what's interesting is the wood there's no necessarily nails. It all fits together, correct? And when they put water in it, the water actually comes out, but the wood grows and it eventually closes up. So talk a little bit just about the process of that, or has the technology changed much over the years since the 1800s when you guys built those first water tanks? The only change has been the system of installing the tanks. It's been organized and confined so that a tank can be taken down at 7 o'clock, starting at 7 o'clock in the morning, and put back at 5. And I guess as we work so vigorously, I've always defined our
crews and the people in the industry as the spirit of New York. I think at this age of my own self, I must be one big splinter. And when I get wet, I swell up like a wood tank. But we lose very little water after the tank goes up.
One of the questions I have is sometimes, for instance, there was an example of the King County Hospital. You need to replace some of these tanks. This was a 12,000-gallon tank, and you still have to keep the water supply running. So how do you do that?
Well, there are various ways of keeping the water running, and in one way we connect it's a plumbing procedure.
Okay.
We'll connect the top of the plumbing, which is the fill line to the tank, and the house line coming off the tank, and we'll connect the two lines together, and we'll add to the pump station a pressure-reducing valve, and they can maintain, for the time being, a house system.
A lot of steps going into it.
Yeah, with additional alert to the fire watch. Because
so there's so much more than just putting those tanks up, huh? One other thing I noticed is other businesses you guys have, you made wood tanks for soap. New York wine, I think, in the 30s and 40s, you guys supplied 30% of the tanks that the New York State wine was in. I also read every giant panda in the U.S. has a Rosenwach tank. I mean, talk a little bit about just all the different areas that you guys are involved in.
One thing, you'll never want to go into a tank that held wine because you'll never go out again. It's intoxicating. And we've also made a house out of a tank years ago. But we've expanded into different areas to service our accounts, which are building restoration, because every tank sits in a bulkhead that weathers away, and pipes penetrate into roofs, and they need pitch pockets. And we've taken a roofing product in the squares of roofs that we change, and we put them on top of the tanks.
Andy Rosenwach, we're talking the tanks in New York City. We'll be back. You're watching Venture. Welcome back to Venture. I'm Chris Valerio. Today we're talking with Andy Rosenwach. He is the president of Rosenwach Tanks, a company founded in the 1800s that puts up the wood tanks all over the city skyline. And in the break, Andy, we were talking, and I kept trying to push you to figure out, how are you staying competitive? How are you here? And one of the things you mentioned was marketing. So how important is marketing for your type of company, which you yourself said, a mom-and-pop type company, but that's lasted, something that a lot of companies can't claim?
We have a great need to give back, and when we present ourselves, it's always in a good way. Let me say this. See, this is our tie pin.
Okay.
And when we give it out to people, they always remember us.
So you give these. Oh,
take
okay.
this.
Okay. We'll put this.
Yeah.
So you guys give these types of pins out what, to people in Brooklyn, to community members?
Well, actually, it's only to our own people. But that's an example of how we.
So you're saying that corporate culture is very important for you. Keeping the loyalty of your workers is very important.
Very important.
Now, do you guys actually market? Do you put ads in newspapers? Or do the building owners just know you?
The building owners know us, and as I was saying before, you can't just sit back on your laurels. Every day is a new day, and we have to go out and prove ourselves. But we do give and work out on projects. We were at the Smithsonian Folklore Festival, and we put up a tank where millions of people walked through it and enjoyed New York on that way. We are now, I hope, working on the Highland Project over on the West Side Highway, and
what are you doing there? There's
plans of making a stand for refreshments, and the stand may be looking in terms of a tank. We were at the South Street Seaport on an exhibit on healing waters years ago, but we will never say no to a customer. Customer's always right.
Now, what's your relationship with your rival like? It's because it's really your only rival, also been around since the 1800s. What's the relationship? Does your dad, did your grandpa tell you stories about that company growing up, and what's it like now?
Well, Chris, I really don't think Rosenwach has any competition, and I look at
a true New York business owner.
I look at websites, and I've really have no thoughts or any ideas about looking backward, and we definitely try to make the path.
Family is a large part of your business. You're currently working with your son to bring him in. Is that correct? Or
Henry is my son, and I have a wonderful daughter, Alyssa. Henry is much better than me, as is my daughter, and he's studying in college in about 2 years. And he's working in the business this summer, as he did last summer, and I have rave reviews from our guys and women that they're very proud of him.
So many businesses in New York are very family-owned, the ones that last. And how do you think that has been played into the endurance of this company?
Well, succession is very difficult. As I worked with my father, and it's very difficult for father and son to work with each other, you have to realize each other's weaknesses and strengths and learn to respect. And actually, when you start in this business, education becomes from the ground up, and you have to go slow.
And that was Andy Rosenwach of Rosenwach Tanks. Join us for more on Venture. In the meantime, by the way, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm Chris Valerio. Thanks for watching.